Oh my, I didn't realize it said that. Good morning, everybody. Welcome today. We are going to discuss cultivating volunteers. This is our final in the series of running a healthy nonprofit. And the next series or the next quarter will be financials and budgets. So if you're not registered for that and would like to be registered for that, please go to our website at www.cfnoble.org and scroll down to the bottom and you can sign up for that series. And then the last quarter will be we'll be covering grant writing. And so again, go to the website and scroll down to the bottom of the homepage and you will see the link to be able to register for the next 2-quarter series. And so today, like I said, we're going to do cultivating volunteers. And I do ask you to use the chat box for asking any questions. If we need further information for your question, then we'll unmute you and you can share some further information about your question. And so today we have Casey Weimer with us today. Casey is the CEO of the Cole YMCA Family Center, where she served since 2011 or 2011. Prior to serving in her current capacity, she was the Human Resource Director for the YMCA of Greater Fort Wayne, where she developed a passion for the work of the YMCA. Before she discovered the Y, though, she worked at an automotive industry in various human resource capacities. She received her bachelor's degree in public policy management from Indiana University, Bloomington. She volunteers for Big Brothers Big Sisters and serves on the boards of Oak Farm Montessori Community Learning Center and the Kendallville Library Foundation. She has previously been a CASA volunteer and is currently active as a Kendallville Rotary Club member as well as a past president. So Casey, you take it over.
Thank you, Margarita. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here so we can, where did my share screen? Oh, there we go. Button go. All right. Well, again, welcome. Thanks, Margarita, for the introduction. One of the things that you'll kind of notice in my background is HR was my primary discipline prior to joining the Y. And so a lot of what you're going to hear is some of an HR flair to the things that we're talking about, and probably a little more in depth than maybe you would want relative to the HR issues relative to volunteers. So just that's my little caveat at the beginning, that's kind of my background, and that's why you might get a little bit of a spin to that. And while the Y utilizes volunteers extensively, we have a lot of volunteers in our organization and frankly couldn't make it run. The presentation I'm going to share with you today is a lot about best practices and sort of the best way to do things. That doesn't mean that if you volunteer for the Y, everything's going to be exactly the way I'm recommending to you and that we've got it all sort of figured out, because this really is about best practices. And I'm thankful to be part of a large organization that I have access to a lot of best practices. So I'm going to share a few documents with you today that may be Y branded. I have access to a lot of other materials and things that as we go through our conversation, if you find a desire for those, I can share those with you as well. That's one of the benefits of being part of a large national nonprofit, is we have access to a lot of best practices, or other people have figured out the best solutions throughout the country and we just get to copy them. So I have access to a lot of that stuff if you wanted. So that's what you'll kind of see today. And then a lot of what I'm going to share is my experiences as being a volunteer. I'm a volunteer, like Margarita said, on boards. I have been a long-term volunteer with Big Brothers Big Sisters. I've been mentoring youth I've had her since 3rd grade, and she's going to be a sophomore next year. So I've done that for a long period of time. Again, I do a lot of volunteer projects through the Rotary. And so you're going to hear some of those stories and things that happen just from my perspective as a volunteer, in addition to running an organization that uses a lot of volunteers. Also going to give you a little caveat that creativity is not my strength. These are not going to be fun and exciting PowerPoint presentations. That's not where I'm good at things. I'm really hoping that we can have a lot of discussion today. And so I invite you all to share. Which then takes me to my next question. I would invite you all to turn on your camera if you want to. I know for me personally that if I don't have my camera on, I disengage quite a bit more and aren't as participative. And we will have points through this discussion and conversation where I'm going to ask you to share, and it's always more enjoyable, I think, for all of the participants if we can see your face and share. But I understand that we all are Zooming from different places and have different things going on in our backgrounds, and that may not always be possible. So I get that, but I would just invite you to consider turning on your camera. All right, so the things that we're going to kind of talk about today is really, why do we use volunteers at all? Why are they important to our organization? What are really the different types of volunteers? Because the types of volunteers can really dictate how we manage things and how we cultivate them, because they vary widely. How to plan for your volunteers, how to recruit and screen volunteers, how to orient and train them, supervise and evaluate, recognize and celebrate, and ultimately retain them. So this is the first participative part. So really, why do you use volunteers in your organization at all? I mean, we all know that sometimes it's easier to manage and hold staff accountable. So why not just do everything with our staff? So this is where I'm going to ask you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so hopefully we can see each other more. And I'm going to ask you each to just kind of share in general why you use volunteers at all.
Well, I'll share because I got to jump off at 9:15. For the Community Learning Center, it's important for us to have volunteers to engage them in all the work that we're doing here so that they begin to understand what we do here, and to keep them engaged and involved, and also to get their feedback on what kind of programming we're doing to see whether it's meeting their needs.
So that's good, Julia. Really a chance to educate the public about the mission of your organization and make sure that there's a deeper understanding of the organization, and get feedback on how to run your organization better.
Without our volunteers, we wouldn't be able to run the programming that we do and do the outreach that we do. But also for us, having our neighbors, those are the folks that some would call clients. We choose not to use that hierarchical language, but those that are our neighbors have become our volunteers, which gives, we like to highlight the value that they bring to the organization. And then bringing in volunteers from the outside of our organization puts those neighbors in spheres of influence that would not normally be around them. So it creates a mentoring sort of relationship and friendships that can help both parties grow. So a lot of different reasons for us.
So, but it really sounds like it helps fulfill your mission by using volunteers.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, yeah,
absolutely.
I could definitely echo that. For us at the clinic, using volunteers is dual fold. It allows the community to participate in improving the health of the community because they can volunteer their time. They can use their skills as a dentist or as a nurse practitioner or as a massage therapist or as someone trained in optics or hearing screenings, their skills as a social worker or language interpreter. But it also really greatly improves the lives of our clients to be able to have someone with that fresh energy, passion for what we're doing. So it's a dual fold that meets the needs of our community that have a healthcare need, but it meets the needs of our community for people who really want to make a difference and have just these fantastic skills that they can use to help others.
Thank you, Grace. Again, it sounds like really about really fulfilling your mission, which is exciting to hear that that's what most of few that shared. Does anyone else want to share why they really use volunteers? That's an exciting part, because sometimes it's regularly people go to, like, it saves us money, we're able to spend less money running our operations with volunteers, and there is a component of that. Interestingly, volunteerism is valued at about $187 billion a year annually in the US. So it's a big deal for making our economy kind of move. And most recent surveys are really indicating that an hour of volunteer service is valued at your organization at about $28 an hour. And so while it helps fulfill your mission, it does have a financial impact as well. The other part we're going to talk about is the fact that 67% of people who volunteer in your organization, this is a national statistic, and obviously this can vary, contribute financially to your organization. And so that tying them in especially close. You heard in my bio that I serve on the board of Oak Farm, and Oak Farm has been a very fortunate organization in that been able to do a lot of things and have really been in an infancy in cultivating our donor base. And we noticed quickly when we engaged volunteers in meaningful work, things that were purposeful, that they really got an understanding of the organization, that they started donating. Even though they were parents and they knew about the organization and things before, they were really not giving their philanthropic dollars until they were engaged in a meaningful work and saw really the value of that inside an organization. So that can be sort of another impact of having volunteers. And many of you also talked about, especially you, Grace, that sometimes you have skills or needs that you can't meet within your organization. They have unique things that you need to do. For example, we've had an electrician that has volunteered their time to come in and fix a timing system in the swimming pool. And those are just unique skills that someone may have that you don't have. And so that's another real reason for using volunteers. And then the most important, which I was excited to hear was at the forefront of what people shared, is that it engages in your mission. And it really helps fulfill your mission, much like Julia said, helps educate people, who give you a broader reach about what your organization does. And they then can share with other people. Or like Angie said, it really helps uplift I know you don't use the term clients, but it helps uplift the people that you're serving, which is part of your mission, and help to regularly engage that. So volunteers really can help in a nonprofit, not just from a financial standpoint. Well, that's an important piece. Like, for example, if we had to hire all of our youth sports coaches, we wouldn't be able to run as many youth sports programs as we do, because we would not be able to afford to pay all of those staff to do that. So it can be a really twofold thing. So thanks for sharing all of that. Let me go back to sharing my screen here so you can. It's not advancing. Let's see. All right, I'm not sure why I can't advance the slide. I apologize for my technical difficulties here. All right, let's try this again. So we also want to kind of talk about types of volunteers, because our volunteer management policies and the way we manage and deal with volunteers can vary substantially based upon the type of volunteer that you're working with. And so I just kind of wanted us to think in terms, as we move forward with this discussion, in the types of volunteers that you might use and how you would take these different components of things and utilize them differently. Policy volunteers is sort of our first and foremost that we think of. Thus, your board member and committee members that help set the strategic direction for your organization. Then there are sort of those one-off event volunteers. Maybe you're hosting a golf outing or a fundraiser event or things, and you utilize volunteers for a one-time little project, or you have a corporate group that comes in and does something that you kind of need to manage that. Then there are project volunteers, that kind of thing. Maybe they come in, you know, I'm sure that most of you've had organizations that they want to bring in a volunteer group, and so you've got to manage that, whether that be like an Engaged Sunday or a day of giving kind of thing from the United Way. And so that feels very different, obviously, than managing your policy volunteers. And then some of you have those ongoing or longer term volunteers, maybe a hospital welcome person. For us, that's like a youth sports coach, or my volunteer work with Big Brothers Big Sisters. Those are kind of longer term things. And so your training and orientation, all that stuff may look different than that. And then that person that comes in, like I said, the person that comes in and helps me with something quick, that I used a scuba diver to scrub some bottoms of the pool that we needed scrubbed, and someone had to know how to dive to be able to do that. And that was a unique skill. But again, we manage that differently than we would some of those longer ongoing volunteers. So I invite you to just kind of think about that as we move forward with our discussion. So many of you answered this question in survey ahead of time, and how does your organization really utilize volunteers currently? And I thought it would be helpful based on what we just went over, the different types of volunteers, if a couple of you would share how you currently utilize volunteers, because I think sometimes we get so used to how we use volunteers that we don't always think about how volunteers are used in other organizations. And I also thought it was interesting, only one or two of you, when you responded, included your board members as volunteers in how you currently utilize them. So it's just thinking about how we define volunteers. So is anyone willing to kind of share? Not everyone needs to, but just so that we can be thinking about the different types of volunteers that exist, how you currently use volunteers in your organization.
I'll go for that. I'm from ARC Animal Rescue, and we use a little bit of volunteers for our day-to-day, but that's mostly paid positions. But definitely any event that we do, all of our board members are volunteers. Anything special that's going on, like when we clean up around the shelter and stuff like that, that's all volunteer. We have a few volunteers that come in just to play with the animals or take them on walks. And we have one gentleman that we absolutely adore right now that's doing all of our maintenance.
Yep.
So,
Lucky when you can get a long-term volunteer that also has a unique skill set.
oh my goodness, yes.
I can answer too a little bit. I'm Jill Yoder with Crossroads United Way. Currently, we have a little bit of everything. We have events like Power of the Purse and Cardboard Boat Race where we use volunteers. We also have a Read United program that is the school year and seasonal. So we have ongoing volunteers, kind of long-term volunteers for that. And then we have committees, cabinets, and we actually have a volunteer that comes in weekly too for stuff around here.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay. And I don't know why when I go off the screen sharing, it doesn't want to advance my slide. So we'll try this again. You can see that I'm not. All right. So the next thing when we think about the sort of the process of our volunteers is really planning, to think about, be purposeful about how we utilize volunteers. And so in your planning process, and things you're going to want to think about, and this is not a you should absolutely do this or that, but it's kind of raising questions. Have you thought about these things? Have you put these processes into place? And one is to engage your staff, or set the expectations of what you expect the staff to be responsible for, what you expect the volunteers to be responsible for, because sometimes when those lines can get a little blurry, it can be difficult. And also define, does your volunteer process, is it going to be more centralized approach where you have a volunteer coordinator and all volunteers kind of come through that volunteer coordinator? Or does each sort of program area or staff person manage their own unique set of volunteers? Neither one is necessarily a best practice or the other, but you need to sort of know what you're going to do as you go into that. So that will affect your recruitment and training and all of those other pieces that we're going to go on and talk about later. But you kind of need to know that going forward when you're starting to plan. And then also setting really expectations about how you will or will not work for volunteers. For example, we would never put a volunteer in a lifeguard position or a life-saving position. That would always be something that's going to be a paid staff. So you may have things in your organization that you decide, we will never use a volunteer to do this type of work for whatever reason. But your staff as a whole needs to know that ongoing, especially if you have a decentralized approach and you let everyone kind of manage their own volunteers, if you don't have those things set on the forefront. And then that really you need to assess your needs as you move forward. I was excited to hear that many of you have embedded the need for volunteers into your mission. And that's really an important piece when you're assessing your needs and how you're going to use volunteers, rather than just, we've got this extra thing we can't figure out how to get done, and we're going to use volunteers for that, but really how to embed it into the work that you're doing. Again, assessing special skills or needs that you might have. One really important thing that I think really needs to be part of your planning and assessment if you're doing volunteers for a special project is, how many people do you really need? because one of the absolute worst things that you can do to a volunteer is start a project where you need about 3 or 4 people to accomplish it effectively, and you bring in about 12 or 15 and the rest of them stand around. That's sort of the worst thing that you can do to a volunteer. And so I think you need to be purposeful on the onset of any projects and things, thinking about how much, what is really your need, rather than just, hey, can we have a bunch of people show up to help do a certain thing. The other thing is really think about, when you're assessing your needs, what's your organizational capacity? How many people can you really manage? Do you have the staff input? Do you have the things necessary to be able to manage that many volunteers? Whether that's on a project basis or a long-term volunteer or any of those pieces. To be fair, at times we've had to say no to things like Engage Sunday because we didn't have the organizational capacity on those particular events to manage the set of volunteers. And so you really need to spend some time assessing your needs and whether your organization can meet those needs. And then you need to spend some time around really defining your volunteer policies. What kind of access to your building or your staff or your clients that you serve or your participants are you going to have? Those need to be clearly defined. Should any policies be different for volunteers than staff? Obviously, we spend a lot of time, and many of you probably do too, around child safety and what type of policies exist around child safety. And we do have a little bit of different policies around volunteers than staff, because volunteers never operate programs without staff present. So their background checks maybe are a little less in depth because that doesn't exist for us. But an organization that I volunteer, like Big Brothers Big Sisters, when I am the volunteer with that youth does not have staff around, those policies look a little different. So you really need to sit down and define what are your policies around volunteers going to be. And do they vary based on the type of volunteer that we talked about? You know, your board members may not need, if you're dealing with vulnerable or at-risk populations, the same level of screening that your people on the sort of boots on the ground do. And so think about your policies as they vary based on your volunteer type. And then one of the things, again, here's my HR bent that you're going to hear, is to really think about how your policies match up to the Department of Labor regulations, because I'll tell you, a lot of people get this wrong. And I'm going to share a document with you that Margarita's going to send out after the fact, that we can just take a brief look at. And this is a document obviously put together by the YMCA, but it applies for all volunteers. And it's really understanding how volunteers work. And a volunteer really is someone who does something for the organization that is not compensated. That means they're not compensated. So in the Y world, people love to say, well, I'm going to give them a membership to the Y for volunteering with the organization. Well, that's compensation, and the Department of Labor doesn't really like that. And so you want to kind of think about those things. The other place that I see, and again, I'll share this document, I'm not going to go through it piece by piece, but I'm just going to kind of highlight the areas where I see people usually make mistakes. The other is my secretary or my office clerk is doing something in the organization. Sometimes she helps do other things, but on this Saturday, I'm going to go ahead and have her volunteer to do this project or event that we're not going to pay her for on that day, because she's going to be a volunteer on that day. And the Department of Labor looks at those things really with a great degree of scrutiny as well. You know, was that person really there voluntarily? Was it sort of, they felt like that was a necessary part of being part of their job? How close is it to the work that they do that they're getting paid for on a regular basis? So you really want to closely scrutinize your policies around that as well. So again, this document will be sent out to you. It's several pages long, but it's a good just list of questions to think about. How are your policies in line with the Department of Labor? And then lastly, let's see if we can get on. Lastly, I think it's always a good idea to create a service or a job description for your volunteers. Volunteers want to know what's expected of them, and that can be really helpful. I think that's probably more appropriate for a longer term volunteer, not necessarily a project volunteer or one-off volunteer. It's good for your board. I know that we clearly outline the expectations for our board members in a board member job description. So let's sort of start at the beginning. We think about needing to recruit volunteers. And some of you mentioned that in your pre-survey, that that's one of the things that you struggle with, is really how to recruit volunteers. And first and foremost, sort of look nearby. Do your staff know people that would be interested in your organization? Do you have people that are physically near your organization, that sit in your same community or same neighborhood? That might be good. That's always a good place to start. And then also think about who's already involved in your organization. You know, Angie mentioned that she does that system pretty effectively in using who's already involved in your organization, but that's really a good recruitment tool. And sometimes I think we don't always look there. For example, let's think about, I don't think many churches are having their Sunday school teachers come from outside their congregation. They look right immediately in their congregation for those set of volunteers. And so that's sort of a good place to start. Similar with us, as we look at our youth sports coaches, which are all volunteer for us, we go to parents of kids that are already enrolled in the programs. And so look at people who are already involved in your organization. Local organizations and corporations, I mentioned before, sometimes they want to come do projects. I think given the fact that people are struggling to even staff their current positions right now, is those are not as plentiful as they maybe have been in the past. But that's something. Internships are always a good way to look at things too. Community service is an option. I don't have that listed. We do that a lot. We have folks that regularly come through the criminal justice system who need to meet their community service hours. And again, we use them in different ways than we might, but there still can be really effective. And then think about your social media or online presence. As researching for this, I found an interesting statistic that over 60% of people find their volunteer opportunities by searching online for different things, which I thought seemed fairly high, but it was still an option. And then through the why recommendations that we got, there were a couple of sites. I have not used these two sites, volunteermatch.org or Idealist. And there you see a typo that I have there. Idealist.org. I have not utilized those, but those are recommendations that we've been given out of YMCA, the USA, to potentially recruit volunteers. And then when you think about recruiting volunteers, those examples that I gave you were just sheer numbers and finding the people, but how do you really find the right people, the ones that match your organization? And I think having a consistent message about what your organization is, why we need volunteers, and what is important for that. I also have a document that I'm going to share with you that is about a sample volunteer recruitment message that's pretty standardized. And so Margarita will send that out after as well, that you might find helpful. This was a really interesting statistic, I thought, which speaks to the heart of someone being tied to the mission of your organization, that 71% of people who volunteer for one organization and one organization only. And so if you want to be that organization of choice for that person, you've really got to tie that to your mission, and they have to care about your organization. Personally, when I choose to volunteer on things that are on board level or policy level, but are sort of the boots on the ground, I care about serving at-risk youth. That's why you see that I've been a CASA volunteer and I'm a Big Brothers Big Sister volunteer. And so understanding that when you're recruiting someone about what's their passion, what's really important to them, can help you tie them to your organization. The other thing, when you maybe found the best person that you think will do a really great job volunteering for an organization, think about what barriers might exist for them. Sometimes childcare is a barrier for people. They would like to help do something, but childcare is a barrier. There are ways you can help remove that for them. Is transportation a barrier? Is time a barrier? For some people, the time commitment you're asking for is too big. And so is there a way you can break that down into smaller pieces so that that barrier for them is removed? And maybe when you were looking for one volunteer to do something, you can break it down to 2 or 3 so that the time commitment isn't a large barrier. Or is there some things that people can do from home? We've all gotten better at that over the last year, right? Figuring out things that can be done from home. And I don't think many of us thought of using volunteers much from homework before, but there are really ways that that can happen as well. So after you've kind of found your volunteers, the next step is really screening them, both for risk and for the right placement. And so because I'm a youth serving organization, I have a real bent towards screening volunteers around risk, but many of you also serve other vulnerable populations that need to be concerned about risks as well. So I think it's important to have a volunteer application where you're capturing data about the people that volunteer for you so that you know kind of what's going on with them. And then consider the risks and create your screenings appropriately to the type of volunteer that they may be and the risks that exist. I saw a couple of great matrices where people would say these are the different types of volunteers and what we require of them as far as background checks and things. You also want to consider when placing a volunteer, how does it really impact your organization's reputation? You know, based upon that person's background, do you want them serving on your board? Do you want them a forward-facing part of your organization? Or is there work that they can do? For example, when we use a lot of the folks from the criminal justice system, we aren't necessarily putting them volunteering as our youth sports coach. But just because we're thinking about those different types of things, we may get to know them more and may eventually use them for something like that. But you want to kind of think about that on the onset. And then what about the people that you're serving? How do they view the volunteers that you have in place? And so you need to be cognizant of that as you're screening volunteers and placing them as well. So we're screening them for risk. And then we also screen them for their skills and interests. So it's a good time to sit down and talk to them about what they really like, what's important to them, and match the volunteer to the job or work that you know they might be interested in. I recently recruited a new volunteer as a board member and was talking to him. And he currently sits in a financial position in his job. And I had another board member recruiting with me and said, oh, you would probably love to be on our finance committee then, because you know that's your background. And he was like, actually, I would really love to not do that. Is there someplace else that I can serve? Because that's what I do every day. And so I really don't want to serve in that capacity. So sometimes we always think, oh, I've got this marketing person, and so I'm going to put them doing the marketing volunteer work for my job. So it's good to talk to the people and figure out what's really their passion, what they're excited about. Is someone coming to choose to volunteer in your organization because they have a particular skill or growth piece that they want to do? They want to learn a new skill. And so can you place them in an area that they can learn that new skill? You also need to talk to them about how much they really are willing to commit. Like, what's their level of commitment as you interview them and talk about it? And that helps you place them in a better way. And then this is hard for a lot of us that serve volunteers. Not everyone's a good fit for you. And it's hard to say when someone wants to come serve your organization that, you know, I just not sure we've got a real good spot for you. That's hard. But believe me, I've had to fire a lot of volunteer sports coaches who didn't behave in a way that was appropriate for our organization. But it's hard to do. But I think if you're really going to have a good, robust volunteer management system, you need to be willing and able to say that. So now you've recruited them, you've got them as part of your team, and you need to orient and educate them. And again, like all of the things we're going to talk about, this varies based upon what type of volunteer they're going to be. If someone's going to come in and just help you for a couple hours with one little project, I'm not sure you need to spend hours educating them on your mission and your values and the history of your organization and all of that. But it is always a good time whenever you have someone doing that to help continue to do that. I mean, Julia mentioned that at the beginning when we talked about that's one of the reasons that she uses volunteers, is to really help educate people about the organization. When you're orienting and training them, you know, make sure their basic needs are met. They know where to get a drink of water. They know where to go to the restroom. I know that seems crazy, but sometimes we miss basic steps like that with volunteers. Consider any required trainings. For example, we have a lot of required training for our youth sports people around concussions. And, or do you need to do it around child abuse and prevention, or whatever your organization looks like? What are those required trainings that need to be done? And ensure that they know your policies. You know, we have a very strict policy, which is different than other organizations that, like I serve for Big Brothers Big Sisters, you're never alone with a child. That's our policy. And so we need to make sure that our volunteers know that policy as well. And then clearly outline what's expected of them. And then how can you help them? Do you need to assign them to someone who's volunteered with you for a long period of time, who can be a guide or a mentor to them and help things going, or really make sure that they have a knowledge of what's expected and who to go to if they don't know what to do next. So we've done all this work. Now here's where the rubber really meets the road. You've got the volunteers, you've got them trained, and they're in your organization and ready to go. And how can you help to manage that? Have a clear staff contact so they know who to go to. I see this especially on projects, like, oh, everyone's here to help, and they run into a question, they don't have the right tool, or they don't have the right thing, they don't even know who to go. and ask questions too. So that's a really, seems like a simple step, but I have been at a number of volunteer projects where that step was not clearly defined for me as a volunteer. So I know that it doesn't always happen. And then check in with them regularly. Do you need to answer any questions? Do they need to make sure that they know that the job is complete? And then find out if they're enjoying themselves. Are they having fun? Do they like what they're doing? Has this been a satisfaction for them? Make sure you're inclusive, address their issues quickly, and then ask for feedback about your organization. Julia mentioned that she does that with volunteers, like what type of programming would you like to see at the CLC? What kinds of things would you be interested in? Or if you're asking for feedback and they're hating what they're doing, you can reassign people, move them to different spots. If they're saying, you know, you keep putting me on this job and I really don't like it, can I do something different? And then always evaluate impact. Ask yourself, was this a good use of their time? Because I know as a volunteer, when I go, if I don't feel like it was a good use of my time, I'm not going to be interested in coming back. And so you should regularly, as you're supervising and evaluating volunteers, ask yourself, was this really a good use of their time? And did it really have an impact on our organization? So one of the things we regularly talk about then with volunteers is after you've supervised them, they've done their project, how do you recognize and celebrate volunteers? I've got some ideas and things here I want to share with you, but each organization can kind of bring, this is where the best sharing happens, I think, because we get to listen and say, oh, wow, that's a great idea. How do you recognize and recognize volunteers? So I'm going to stop sharing for a second here and invite some of you to share about how do you recognize your volunteers?
We just had, with the help of First Christian Church, you know, that's a church that's a kind of a partner with us and is always wanting to know what they can do to help in a different way than others may do, to fill a gap, so to speak. And so they just did a volunteer banquet for us, hosted us there, and we were able to celebrate that. You talked about the value of the hours. We were able to tell them, you know, you gave us $70,000 worth of hours in 2020. You know, that's a lot. And if you look at the percentage of our budget, it's almost half of our budget. So, you know, just, you know, we had a couple of drawings for things, but nothing spectacular, and just giving them time to be together and just celebrating them. So we're working on some new things too, but we're not there yet.
What did you use for your hourly wage to calculate your 70,000?
I think it was, Casey's right, it was like $27.85. I can tell you that pretty quickly, probably here.
The most recent statistic I pulled was $28.54, but it's kind of bounced around a little bit. I think.
Yeah, it depends on, it's right around there. It depends on which source you look at. But if you Google volunteer 2020 volunteer national volunteer rate or something like that, it's going to give you some to look at. And I just sort of took one that was sort of in the middle of things, and and look at your own area too. You know, in the rural community, that's going to look different than it does in a city. So, you know, we took one that was, you know, what we thought was pretty, you know, would be appropriate for our community. They're all pretty similar though.
Any other ways people recognize or celebrate their volunteers?
We did something a little similar to Angie, and it was a lot of fun. We did a volunteer luncheon, and we invited all of our volunteers in, and we had lunch with them, and then Julia went around and talked about each one. So they really liked being singled out, per se, saying like what they did for us, anything from our photographer to our quilting instructor to like all kinds of things. So we had, and then we also invited staff up there because we invited our board and staff just because they do so much outside of what the normal workday too. So it was really nice to kind of go through and just single out each person. And it wasn't long. It was maybe a sentence or two. And then she shared a story, like a funny story of something happened. And it just really brought everybody together, and they were able to meet each other too. Because a lot of times our piano teacher doesn't always meet our quilting instructor. So it was nice for them to get to meet each other too.
In the past, we've done large scale volunteer banquets. Last year, we didn't do that with COVID. And so this year we did a ice cream bar for them. It opened it up to all the volunteers to come in for, ice cream sundaes and decorate their own. We also made sure to send out personal cards to volunteers during Volunteer Appreciation Week. We did it for board members as well because there are volunteers. Our executive director worked it out where one of the massage therapists in our community volunteered her time and gave 10-minute back massages to some of our nursing staff that were volunteers during Nurses Week. We try to do little touches throughout the year. We also do a volunteer spotlight on our website to kind of highlight some special skills that maybe people don't realize we have volunteering at the clinic. And it's been really exciting to get to meet more and more volunteers, and they share their story and invite other people to participate. Because some of our patients have a real relationship with some of our longer term volunteers, and they say, oh, well, when will nurse so-and-so be in? Or, oh, when will doctor so-and-so be in? Because they've built a relationship with that volunteer and they want to be scheduled when that volunteer is there. We've had dinners. We've done lots of little things for our students. Last year during exam week, we got crunch bars and wrapped them up and wrote a little message of encouragement to them and said, we know it's crunch time, but thanks for being, it was because it was exam week for them, but thanks for still being our volunteer, because it might be a requirement that they do an internship, but they have a lot of places to choose from and they chose us, so we want to choose them back.
Anyone else want to share?
I'll share. My name is Abby. I am with CASA. I'm actually the volunteer coordinator. Brooke is normally on these calls, so she couldn't be here, so I'm filling in because it's kind of my area of expertise. So I took over this position about a year ago. I was just a guardian ad litem prior to that. And we've really revamped and kind of are really trying to get our volunteers more involved. Because before we were only really doing an appreciation banquet once a year, but I felt like we needed to do more than that because they all really like to build relationship with other volunteers that they're working with in their community. So this year, for the month of April, we did kind of a lot of different things. Each week, we did a volunteer spotlight. We did random giveaways. We made everybody volunteer t-shirts that, on the back it says that they're an everyday hero. So we kind of did something big and special for everybody each week of the month of April. And then moving forward, we're going to do just a monthly volunteer spotlight. And then they'll get a goodie bag with CASA things in them. In August, we are doing a volunteer picnic. And it's going to be kind of like a potluck. Everybody's going to bring a dish and they can bring their kids, and it's going to be at a local park up in Albion with a splash pad so their kids can come and play, or their grandkids. And then we're also going to do our volunteer banquet again in November, but we're really trying to spruce that up a little bit. And we always recognize milestone volunteers, so 5, 10, 15, 20-year volunteers, and we get them a gift that says how many years they've been a volunteer, and we kind of give a little speech about them. So we're going to continue to add new things for our volunteers, but that's kind of what we've been able to add this year with COVID and everything like that. But hopefully we can grow it each year. So
Thank you, Abby. Is anyone else interested in sharing? I don't want to. Okay, I'm gonna just share some thoughts about how you put together your recognition and celebration. First and foremost, I know this sounds simple and basic, but I cannot tell you how regularly this is missed, and that is just thank you. Just simple thank you. I have volunteered at a number of times at a golf outing where I've shown up and said, okay, I'm here to help volunteer at the golf outing. I said, okay, well, over there you can grab lunch, and here's what you need to do, and here's your packet of information, and not one person in the organization said thank you for being here. And so that can get really missed in the shuffle of what we're doing. And so that can be really basic. Even in your regular conversations, thank you for being here. That goes a really long, it probably goes further than anything else that you can do. And so when you think about your recognition and celebration of volunteers, that's probably the most critical thing I think that you can do. And it seems so simple and basic that I think sometimes it just gets missed. I liked that someone talked about recognizing the individual contributions. I think Macy talked about how Julia recognized each individual person for the work they're doing, or people are doing volunteer spotlights. Those really feel more meaningful because you're recognizing my individual work that I'm doing, as opposed to just like, hey, thanks to everyone who's been a volunteer for our organization. And that recognition really feels more important. Angie talked about that, demonstrating the impact of the organization, and that when people know that, that's really kind of an important thing. I personally, when we look at volunteer recognitions, the things I love that I've gotten are simple, like card portfolios of pictures of the impact that has happened, or the program that I served in, and how that impacted me. And those are pretty inexpensive little ways, but pictures kind of show a lot. I'm going to challenge everyone as we think about multiple different ways of volunteer banquets are kind of a regular thing people do. And I'm not downplaying them or saying that they're bad, but I will tell you, as a perspective of a volunteer that I am, it feels like one more obligation to me than a real recognition. But when I get an individual written thank you note with a photo or something, that is all I really need. But everyone's different. I had a boss that I worked for a long time that was in the nonprofit world, and he loved every little trinket that people sent him, whether it's the little, squishy ball, or the different things that their organization had their organization's logos on it as a thank you. He loved those. He collected them all. And so I think thinking about the multiple different ways and communicating your appreciation in multiple different ways, because it resonates different with every person. Some people would love the volunteer spotlight. Some people would hate it if you recognize them individually and make that a big deal. So I am not a lover of going to volunteer appreciation banquets. Some people love any free meal that you're going to give to them. And so think really about how you can customize that, which is hard to do, especially the more you manage a lot of volunteers, the more that it becomes difficult to really customize to what people really want and how they like to be recognized. But I encourage you to kind of think through those different ways. The other thing is to really take care of your volunteers and make sure that they feel that level of appreciation. And then create any incentives for skill development. You talked about recognizing longevity, but are you recognizing someone who has maybe risen up in your organization with different levels of skill development? And how do you recognize that piece of things? So that can be important as well. So we've recruited them, trained them, supervised them, recognized and thanked them. And then how do you make sure they stay with you? And that's really what we would go through all of that work that we've talked about up until this point. How do we ensure that they stay with you? And what we know from this is sort of the negative bent of it, which is not my intention, but what we know is that volunteers leave organizations for these various reasons. They felt like no one told them what was going on. They didn't know when to show up, or how long when I did show up, how long I was going to be expected to be there, or what was really going on. They thought that you were unorganized about things. And that I've seen a lot, like, oh, wait, no, just a second. I'm going to move you over here and do this. I didn't really have an idea what was going on because you hadn't done that planning at the beginning very well. Or they didn't feel a sense of professionalism. Here's what I really think is they didn't really feel like they're having an impact or making a difference. People volunteer when they really want to know that they're making a difference. And so making sure that they understand the impact that they're making, whether that's just individual conversations or kind of in the more grandiose piece like Angie was talking about, or they didn't receive any feedback. No one told me if they thought that I was doing a good job, or I thought I was doing a terrible job, or I had no idea whether you liked me or didn't like me. Those are the reasons that people want to leave. Here's the other real thing is they didn't feel appreciated or valued. I'm going to share a story that seems really minuscule and small, but these are how we have to manage volunteers. And we sometimes think of these big picture of big volunteer recognition things, and it's really about that, giving individual feedback and taking care of things. some friends of mine were volunteering at a particular golf outing. They were assigned to a hole to monitor some things. A storm blew up. They were out there with no golf cart. They had been dropped off. Storm blew up, called in all the golfers, and left my volunteers out there in the middle of the course with the thunder and lightning. They're not super inclined to volunteer for this organization again, because there was that recognition, like they didn't even know they were out there. They didn't know what was happening. And so it's really that making sure that they feel appreciated and valued, because number one, if you didn't even know I was out there, was the work that I was doing for you that day really that necessary? Probably not. And so it's about being that purposeful, meaningful work is really what helps retain people, and knowing that what they did made a difference and had an impact. So that is really all I have. Thank you for all of your sharing today, and I will entertain any questions. I told Margarita I would go take questions along the way, but then I never really paused for her to ask questions. So Margarita, are there things in the chat box?
We don't have any questions. We have a lot of great comments. Angie shared quite a bit about what they're doing. Angie, do you want to share briefly about your volunteer book, handbook and stuff?
Sure. So when we restructured, we learned a lot about what is actually required of a nonprofit in the sense of corporate documents and handbooks and things. So we just took our employee handbook and went through it and just left anything that would apply to a volunteer, took out the things like volunteer or like vacation time, things that would not apply to a volunteer. We just took that out of our handbook and left that handbook pretty much intact. So the rules for the staff and the volunteers are the same. And that creates a sense of consistency. And often our neighbors, when they come, they don't know who's staff and who's volunteer. And we like that. And so the other thing that we learned the hard way was the importance of background checks. And we went to the sheriff's department to ask the best way to do that. And they actually recommended using doxpop.org. We still have to, we don't have to, because that's a matter of public record. But we do have a release form that lets them know that we are doing a background check, but we run them through DocsPop. And that the sheriff's department actually told us that's what we would do if you sent them to us. So we use that. If we have an employee that we want to do a more in-depth check, we have them do that. They can do that at a state level or federal level, whatever we want to do. But we've never really had to use that. But we did, our experience was we had 2 of them, and one was a volunteer that was not to be around children, that was going into homes to deliver furniture where there were children. And we found that out and had to stop that, obviously. And then the other one was a person who had just so boldly announced he had been arrested for a sex-related crime, at which time we found out he had served 37 years for 2 rapes and leaving a woman for dead. And he had volunteered with us for about 2 years, and everybody loved him. So the board had said, you know, let's just background check the ones that are coming in new. And I said, well, probably we should do everybody. No, we trust our volunteers, right? So just a lesson learned that could have been very ugly, because he obviously was still actively involved in that behavior. And it was pretty scary for us. It could have been really bad. So just those little pieces that they're a lot of work, but once it's done, an annual review of it isn't that difficult to do. So, you know, those documents are important.
Thank you, Angie. So Casey, I have a few more questions for you.
Okay.
Do you have examples of how to fire a volunteer, especially a board member? And then could removing barriers be considered payment of debt to the Department of Labor, or payment by the Department of Labor? And then can you address also why volunteers and staffs, when there's times when volunteers, staff, and donors don't mix? And then I know that's 3 questions, but I have one more. Do you have a liability release waiver for volunteers?
So I'll start with the firing of volunteers. I do think I have a document on how to get rid of a board member. And I'll send that to you, Margarita, and you can share that. It's hard to fire volunteers. It's not the easiest thing in the world, especially board members. And I will tell you that when I've had to do that in the past, I use other board members to help do that. That just works the best because it's really they're managing themselves as a board. And so that's really who it should come from anyway, because the board hires me, I don't hire the board. And so fellow board members should do that. The removing of barriers, no, does not constitute compensation under the Department of Labor. So you can reimburse people for transportation costs, for meal costs, for expenses they incur in the line of volunteering for you. So that is not considered compensation under the Department of Labor. You can, again, pay for expenses that are incurred because of the volunteer work that they're doing for you. Mileage is a typical one for people, like if they've got to drive a fair amount, that you can reimburse them for mileage, and that's not a concern. Refresh me the next question, Margarita.
Is there times when volunteer staff and donors don't mix?
I can't necessarily think because of the role that they would not mix, but like all things, you kind of need to know what personalities people have, and do I assign these two people together? Will they work together as a team or not? I don't think that's necessarily the case because of their role as a volunteer or a staff member, but maybe their personalities and knowing how to manage people in general relative to those personalities. So
Casey,
yeah,
let me add a little bit more context there.
Absolutely.
It's not about them working together. It's about when they shouldn't switch roles. So for instance, if you have a big donor, it might not be the smartest thing to reward them with a volunteer post or a board membership. You might want to let them alone as a big donor. So that was more the intention of the question. Or, you know, what I think you addressed the staff volunteer situation pretty well, but I've always been trained that there are distinct categories and you want to let the folks operate within their distinct categories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in my experience, I'll be honest, I like large donors on my board sometimes because they feel like they have a little, although it's hard to manage because you got to make sure they understand that just because they wrote the big check doesn't mean they get to make all the decisions. But sometimes if people are making that large of an investment, they want to feel like they have some input into the organization. And so it's a delicate balance. Some people may pull their funds completely if they don't feel like they have any influence into the way the organization is being run, or they don't like some of the decisions that have been made. So it's a balance for sure. I don't necessarily know that they have to be kept in completely separate buckets, but it's you want to make sure that when someone's a donor, they understand that doesn't mean they get to influence the policy of the organization. They may have some influence, but they don't get to make the decision.
So Angie, do you also have a liability release waiver for your volunteers?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Casey, do you have?
We don't. We insure all of our volunteers just like staff. So you want to work with your insurance company based upon that and what that looks like. So all of our volunteers are insured the same way for work comp and things like a staff member would be. So you'll want to work with your own individual insurance carriers as to what that might look like. And so we aren't asking our volunteers to be waived of that. We are choosing to insure them.
Okay.
And so that can look different for each organization. So.
Yeah, I want to back up just for a second because this is something that we dealt with early on when we restructured, and we're dealing with it again right now in another organization that I'm a part of. That idea of a donor having say when they've been a donor, now I want to have a say in what's going to happen with that donation. That's a breach of nonprofit law. It has to do with private benefit and inurement. So you can jeopardize your 501c3 real quick if that donor says, okay, now I'm going to give you this money, but I want to be on your board and I'm going to have a say by my vote about what happens with that donation. That can put your 501c3 on the hook big time.
Yeah.
So be really careful with that. We again, that was a hard lesson learned early on. It was part of our reason for restructuring, and we uncovered some things that were happening that nobody really knew that it was wrong. But like, we had donors that would give money to Common Grace and say, this is for my family member, but I don't want them to know I'm giving it. Well, they got a tax benefit for that. And that's illegal. That breaks nonprofit law. Same thing happens when you have a big donor that now wants to be a board member and have a say. They're giving money, getting a tax break for it, and then they get to dictate how that, if they're allowed to, they get to dictate how that money is used, and that breaks that nonprofit law. And if for any of you working in churches, that happens in churches too, and that's what I'm dealing with right now. It stands true for a church as well. A donor cannot give to a memorial fund or something like that and then say, I want to be contacted to tell you how to use that. That's a breach of nonprofit law.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. I am mindful of your time. It is 10 o'clock, so I appreciate you coming. Please remember that our next session will be in July, and we're going to be July 8th, and we're going to do the session on financials and budgets. So if you have not registered, please go to the foundation website at www.cfnoble.org, and on the homepage, scroll to the bottom, and then you will see the links to register for those 2 sessions. And I appreciate you guys coming today. So thank you.
I appreciate